Hello, I'm Pastor Jeff Woods. Today we're going to be discussing 2 Peter 3 and 10. And I want to give you a different view than probably what you've heard before, but I want to talk about the end of the Old Covenant system in the New Testament that the Lord predicted at the fall of the temple in Jerusalem and the establishment of the new kingdom. So he said in 2 Peter 3:10, "But the day of the Lord shall come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up." And so we're going to concentrate on this word elements because it turns up many times in the Bible. And it always turns up in reference to all of the sacrificial systems that had to do with the earthly temple that was destroyed in AD 70. I'm also going to describe this temple to you here. And we find that over in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse number 1. "Then verily the first covenant had also ordinances," and that word ordinances means the same thing, elements, "of divine service and a worldly sanctuary." And so you're going to see here in verse 1, this sanctuary or this temple that the Jews worshipped at was called a worldly sanctuary, having to do with the word world means cosmos, heavens and earth. It was a cosmos sanctuary, and that whole temple represented where heaven came down and met with earth. It was called the temple of heaven and earth. It was called heaven and earth. But before I get into that some more, let's go ahead and describe this a little bit more. The temple itself. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 2. "For there was a tabernacle made, the first wherein was the candlestick and the table and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary." And that was the world sanctuary of the world. The inner sanctuary, beyond that, the second room was called heaven. The first room was called earth. And so we see here that the first tabernacle, the first room that was made was called it had the candlestick, it had the table, it had the showbread. And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all. Now this represented heaven. This is represented God's throne, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid round about with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant. And over it the cherubims of the glory shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now particularly speak particularly. Now when these things were thus ordained, the priest went always into the first tabernacle, that's the tabernacle representing the world, the earth, accomplishing the service of God. But into the second went the high priest alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the heirs of the people. For the Holy Ghost, this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices, which could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining the conscience, which stood only in meats and drinks and divers washings and carnal ordinances imposed on them until the time of Reformation. Now the time of Reformation was basically within a 40-year period, the cross and 70 AD, and 70 AD was the end of the temple, when the old temple system came to a complete end. And it happened within that generation of the contemporaries of Jesus. But you notice here, my main point is that he has a worldly sanctuary. Now I want to show you the elements of the world. So again, we remember as we go back to 2 Peter 3:10, it says here, "Looking hastily unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements, the elements shall melt with a fervent heat." So we go to Galatians chapter 4, verse 3. It says, "Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world." He's speaking of the nation of Israel. "And when they were children, before the coming of the time of the Reformation, of the changing over from the temple unto the spiritual temple, which was Christ's body, but from the old carnal worldly temple unto the new temple of the church." But he said, when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements, the elements of the world. And we saw in the verse that we read before, back in Hebrews chapter 9, that it was a worldly sanctuary. So here we're using these words interchangeably throughout the Bible. The temple was considered, or the holy place, the first room of the temple, was called the world, and all of the services within that temple had to do with, they were called the elements. Everything to do with the candlestick, everything to do with the showbread, and then everything that went out of the temple, and all of the sacrificial, the sacrifices and the sacrificial food offerings, and everything that they had to do. These were, as far as the children of Israel, they couldn't eat pork. They had to have special Sabbath days. All of these things were the elements tied in with the worldly sanctuary. It says in verse 4 now of Galatians 4:4, but when the fullness of the time was come, the fullness of the time, the end of the age, the fullness of the time of the temple sacrifice system, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. This is why all the way through the New Testament, it talks about the last days. The Olivet Discourse talked about the destruction of the temple. It talked about the end of time. The fullness of time had come. Christ was sent forth by God the Father, made of a woman, made under the law, in the first century, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. But we go down to Galatians 4, and let's look at verse 8 and move on to verse 9. Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods. But now, after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? And he says in verse 10, ye observe days and months and times and years. They were trying to get these Gentiles to go back to the sacrificial system. And even though the Jews, many of them continued on in the temple and in the sacrificial system, they did not do it for their salvation or for their hope. The Gentiles were told totally to stay away from it. But you'll notice here that he said, why do you desire to be under this? The elements don't taste. You observe days, months, and times and years. All of the things that came from the worldly sanctuary, these were the elements. When the word elements comes up here, it's not talking about the periodic table of elements that we know today. It's not talking about hydrogen and oxygen and beryllium and all of this. That's not at all what it's talking about. It's talking about the basics of the temple worship system. Let's go over to Colossians chapter 2 and verse number 8. He says, beware, lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the traditions of men, and that's the Talmud of the Jews, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. And so here again, he said the rudiments of the world, and that was talking about the temple, where Jesus himself had said, ye, Sadducees, Pharisees, and scribes, have made my house, my temple, into a den of thieves. And so here Colossians saying, beware lest any man steal from you and rob from you through the rudiments or the basics of the temple. Let's look over at Colossians chapter 2 and verse number 20. It says, wherefore if ye be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why as though living in the world are you subject to ordinances, touch not, taste not, handle not, which all are to perish with the using after the commandments and doctrines of men, which things have indeed a show of wisdom and will worship. So he said the rudiments of the world, or the elements of the temple, are touch not, taste not, handle not, special days, holy days. All of this comes from the temple, and he called it the rudiments of the world. This is not talking about the periodic table. This is talking about what they used from the temple system. And the temple was called the world. So this is from Josephus, who was a first century historian and a man who was captured by the Romans, and he wrote a lot of the history of the wars of the Jews, and he described in detail the end of the Old Covenant system in 70 AD. But it says here, he said here, for if anyone do without prejudice and with judgment look upon these things, he will find they were every one made in way of imitation and representation of the universe. He said this whole temple represents the cosmos, represents the whole universe, and he'll include heaven and earth and the seas. He goes on and says, when Moses distinguished the tabernacle into 3 parts and allowed 2 of them to the priest as a place accessible and common, he denoted. Let me explain that. Made the temple, had the the one sanctuary, which was where the priest went. The Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary, was where the high priest went once a year. The first tabernacle, the first room, was called earth. The second room was called heaven. Outside of the temple, the world. So this is from Josephus, who was a first century historian. The big laver that they washed their hands in was called the sea. So everything in that temple represented heavens and earth, God coming down and meeting with man, heaven coming down to earth. Let's keep reading. He says, the land and the sea, these being of general access to all, meaning all of the priests could go into the first place that was called the land and the sea. And the outer court was the land and the sea. All of the priests could go to the land and the sea. See, it was heavens and earth. Now he said, but he set apart the 3rd division. This was the holiest of all for God, because heaven is inaccessible to men. That's interesting, because Josephus did not understand Hebrews. He had never read Hebrews. But as an Old Testament priest, he said heaven was the inner room where God lived, and man could not get in there. The book of Hebrews says the veil was torn and man could access heaven, access God. But let's read on. 12 loaves to be set on the table. He denoted the year as distinguished into so many months, the 12 months of the year. He said the 12 showbread represented 12 months of the year. By branch 70 parts, he secretly intimated the decani, or the 70 divisions of the planets. And as to the 7 lamps upon the candlesticks, they referred to the course of the planets, of which that is the number. The veils, 2, which were composed of 4 things. They declared the 4 elements, be earth, wind, fire, and water. That's heaven and earth to them in the first century. For the fine linen was proper to signify the earth, because the flax grows out of the earth. What they made the linen out of came from the flax. It represented earth. The purple signified the sea, because that color is dyed by the blood of the seashell fish that produced the purple color. The blue is fit to signify the air, and the scarlet will naturally be the red will be the incarnate indication of fire. He said, now the vestments of the high priest, being made of linen, signified the earth. The blue denoted the sky, being like lightning in its pomegranates, and in the noise of the bells resembled thunder. And for the ephod, it showed that God had made the universe of 4 elements, and of the gold interwoven. I suppose it related to the splendor by which all things are enlightened. He also appointed the breastplate to be placed in the middle of the ephod to represent the earth, for that has the very middle place of the world. And the girdle which encompassed the high priest round signified the ocean, for that goes round about and includes the universe. Each of the sardonyxes declared to us the sun and the moon, those, I mean, that were in the nature of buttons on the high priest's shoulders. And for the 12 stones, whether we understand by them the months, or whether we understand the like number of the signs that circle, which the Greeks call the zodiac, we shall not be mistaken in their meaning. And for the mitre, or the crown, which was of the color blue, it seems to me to mean heaven. For how otherwise could the name of God be inscribed upon the mitre? That it was also illustrated with the crown, and that a gold also is because of the splendor with which God is pleased. Let this explication suffice at present, since the course of many narrations will often and on many occasions afford me the opportunity to enlarge upon the virtue of our legislator. So here's a man who actually walked into the original temple before it was destroyed. Here's a man who actually did the service of the priests. Here's a man who touched and felt the temple. Here's a man who described the whole thing, represented heaven and earth. That's why Jesus said, my words of the New Testament shall last forever. He said, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall last forever. And so we see that all of this represented heaven and earth and all of the elements inside the temple. And that's how the first century readers of the book of Hebrews and the rest of the Bible fully understood it. They said, this is our heavens and our earth. And this is why the Bible said it's getting ready to perish. We're going to move away from the old heavens and earth of the old covenant, move into the new heavens and earth of the new covenant temple. And the new temple was not built with hands. The new temple is us. We are the temple of God. We are the heavens and earth of God. I'm Pastor Jeff Woods. Just something for you to think about. Something for you to think about as we look at the elements of the temple and we describe probably a new version for you to think about. But I believe that what I'm teaching goes consistently with scriptures all the way. And I haven't even covered a lot of the verses in the Old Testament that speak of the temple as heaven and earth, that speak of the nation of Israel as heaven and earth, and how that the Lord talked to them. And he said, your father and your mother, the sun and the moon, and all of your brethren are the stars, being the nation of Israel itself being heaven, and also the nation of Israel being earth, being the stalks of the grass that were standing in the field, and all of the 12 tribes of Israel, heaven and earth. But heaven and earth had an end. And now we are the new temple. We are the new heaven and earth. I'm Pastor Jeff Woods. Thank you for listening in. Tune in next week.